Okay, folks, welcome to another episode of, let me put this here so it doesn't distort. Welcome to another episode of MasterClass Live, and I'm glad you're here. Thank you, everybody, for joining me in Dallas, Texas on a Sunday at noon straight up. I managed to schedule these without lunch break, but I can make it. I have coffee. If you've joined us last time, great. If you haven't, we have that episode archived, so if you go to theartofphotography.tv, click on the link for the masterclass and you can find it. Last time, if you didn't join us, I'll recap just a little bit because I have some additional thoughts and some things. We did talk about keeping a journal and kind of trying to train your mind to take photos. And I think that's a big difference. And in this day and age, see, here's the deal. It's like I think we have a generation now, and it's not really even a generation, it's just a cultural thing, where especially with the internet. I mean, here we're doing a broadcast where I have people from Canada and India and Russia and Australia and everywhere in between watching. And the rate of information that you get is incredible, and you have all that at the tip of your fingers all the time. However, I think that because of this kind of Google age that we live in, sometimes, especially with something like photography or any kind of art thing that takes some kind of sensitive thought that comes into play, it can be, it's kind of, I call it sometimes the age of distraction, because it requires a lot more work than just surfing the web on things. And so that's kind of the point behind a lot of these master classes. And the last one we talked about, actually, the assignments involved not using a camera at all, and getting out this whole concept of, oh, I wish I had my camera with me. And the whole idea with that is that, when you don't have your camera, you start thinking a little differently. And so intentionally, we've taken the camera out of the equation just for last week, and tried to make some notes and concern ourselves with, with seeing something in a different way. And we're going to kind of continue that a little bit today, but we are going to bring the camera back into the equation. Anyway, just some quick notes that I talked about last time. I kind of admitted to you guys that one of my issues that I have with journals is that, I tend to go out and spend a lot of money on these fancy moleskin notebooks, and then I'm afraid to write in them because they're very nice, and that's not what a notebook is supposed to do. They're supposed to do is be nice. One thing, and I will put a link when I set this up for the archive, and it usually takes me a good 24 hours to roll back around to, just because the video takes a long time to compress, but I will put links to things that I talk about in here, kind of show notes like we do with the podcast. If anybody here is familiar with Merlin Mann, who is kind of an internet celebrity guru kind of guy who has a website called 43folders.com. And 43 Folders deals with productivity, personal management, if you will. And one of the things he did a long time ago that got famous for a while on the internet is he made this thing called the Hipster PDA, and this was before the iPhone. And the Hipster PDA was basically some note cards bound together with a bulldog clip. And it was kind of a joke, but tongue-in-cheek in a way that, hey, here's a PDA or a cell phone that doesn't ever crash, it never needs software upgrades, etc. And so one thing that I didn't mention last time, that I actually do the note card thing. And the note card thing's pretty cool, and here's why. Because I left my little stack of note cards with the bulldog clip at my office, and I don't have them today. So when I was at 7-Eleven this morning buying coffee, I bought note cards. So that's the other cool thing, is like you can run into a store and get note cards if you don't have your stuff with you. The other cool thing about this is I like to be able to take note cards out of the stack sometimes, and you could write something down, give it to somebody, or you can organize them, sort them out. But it's a little bit of a homebrew notebook, but it works pretty well. Another thing that I want to recommend, because I had some feedback response via email, and I'm not the only one with the problem of getting a moleskin and being afraid to write in it. This is a book that you can get on Amazon. I'll put a link to it. This is Carrie Smith wrote this. This is called Wreck This Journal. And it says, we're getting to the photography aspect, but Wreck This Journal is cool because it's this basic instructional book. Like the first page says, stand here and jump up and down. And the whole thing teaches you how to just wreck this journal, basically. Draw fat lines and thin, pushing really hard with the pencil. And they give you a lot of space to do this. And it's a little goofy, but at the same time, it's kind of fun. Scribble wildly, violently, with reckless abandon. There's stuff like, put dirt on this page and spread it around. Chew on this, warning, do not swallow. Make a funnel, drink some water. Cut it out, roll tape, and drink water. And so the whole thing is getting you used to this notion of, a journal can be messy. No one else is going to look at your journal but you, and it's important to be messy, I think, because you're not afraid of it. You're going to write down whatever, and that's really the whole concept of what you're getting at. So after you've finally wrecked this entire journal, here's another one. Hang the journal in a public place and invite people to draw here. So here's kind of involving other people in your journal. Collect your pocket lint, glue it here. So, this whole thing is, and obviously I haven't touched this yet, but I just got it in the mail. And then when you're done with it, you tape it together and mail it to yourself. So the whole thing is to get used to being messy and being not afraid to, to just be comfortable with a journal that you're keeping. And I think that's pretty important. So anyway, we talked a little bit about that last time, about keeping a journal. I don't know if anybody had a chance to do the assignment, but I think it's a really good one, because the whole notion is that you're preparing yourself to think, and you're trying to realize that the camera is a tool. And I don't want to exclude the gear completely, because, we're talking about developing your style as a photographer. And I think your equipment is part of that equation. And if you take photographers like somebody like, I was looking at the work of Ralph Gibson this week, and if you're not familiar with Ralph, he's a fine art photographer who's published a lot of books with stuff in it. And he kind of does a lot of slice of life, taking photos of things he sees on the street. And one thing that's, part of his personal style is the fact that a lot of these classic shots are done with 35 millimeter. And 35 millimeter with film has a real specific look to it, and it's really cool. I think you have the grain is just right, and it's a look that you can kind of get there with a digital camera, but it really is part of his whole vibe, and I think that's important to take away. So your camera does have your equipment, I should say, and what type of medium you're shooting on does have something to do with your personal style, and we're slowly adding that back into the equation. But what the idea behind the MasterClass here is to get you guys to learn how to think and to kind of prep yourself for that. So I think that's really important. Oh, another thing that's really handy, and this is really dorky. This is a little tiny pen that I got on Amazon. Also, this is the Fisher Space Pen. And if you're a Seinfeld fan, there was a big joke in here because it's the pen that writes upside down. But I like it because it's tiny and it's easy to put in your pocket and not lose track of. So you always have something to write on, you always have your journal with you, and you don't have any excuse for not recording thoughts, ideas for pictures. Maybe you're in a situation where you don't have your camera, and being able to record that and capture that. Or sometimes I think, as we kind of get further into this and we're training our minds to think more creatively, I think a lot of times you're going to get ideas for pictures. Just, you could be on a bus or a train or in the car or something, and it doesn't relate to anything you're looking at or seeing visually at the moment, but it's something you want to capture because it's an idea you want to come revisit later when you have camera and time and things like that. And being able to capture that and write it down, I think is really important. And like we said last time, we used that, kind of the music analogy. And I can't remember, I think it was an interview with Keith Richards, I believe, that I read years ago, and he was saying, ideas come to him usually before bed or in the morning in the shower. I assume Keith Richards takes a shower. I'm not going to prove that, but anyway, the ideas come to you when your mind is kind of in a state where it's at rest and it's allowed to think. And if you don't capture those, the way our minds work is they tend to leave your mind. And I think it's really important to learn how to capture things. So anyway, enough about that. That was our assignment from last time. And like I mentioned, that most of the curriculum that I have here is cumulative, and that one exercise leads into the next. But I think my approach to this was trying to come up with concepts and ideas that kind of are evergreen in a way, so you could revisit these down the road in the future. And so definitely come back. This is a process. And for this week, we're going to talk about photographic meditation. And I want to mention a few ideas that I had that I think are really important to talk about, because in a way this is kind of like you can think of this as like a personal trainer for photography. I'm trying to inspire you and get you going, and sometimes a lot of this is hard, and it's hard to get better at photography. It's hard to get better at anything. It's hard to get better at writing. It's hard to get better at drawing. And photography is the same way. And I wrote down some ideas, and one is what it takes to get good. And I think it's pretty obvious, but it's difficult. And what it takes to get good is a lot of time, a lot of patience, and a lot of practice. And you got to keep at this stuff, and you got to never give up. And in a way, I think that's really cool, because that's, like I said last time, that's kind of the carrot that you're after, that keeps you going and moving forward. If this were easy, I doubt it would be very interesting to keep doing for very long. So, that's one thing to keep in mind. We talked about practice and musicians, and, back in my music days, I remember, when I started getting into visual work, I was always kind of surprised of the difference that, musicians practice all the time. And if artists that draw and use their hands tend to practice a lot too, because, it's a tough skill and it has to be developed. And I've always been kind of amazed that photographers in general don't have that kind of practice ritual. And it's just not as obvious because it's easy just to click the shutter and take pictures a lot of times. So it's not really a thoughtful practice. And I think that, a lot of us get very consumed with it, and obviously so. I mean, modern cameras have, they can do a million things. They've got all kinds of functions, and it's easy to get bogged down in the mechanics of the camera when you've got to realize that photography is not, the camera doesn't take pictures, you take pictures, and your mind takes pictures. And we're talking in this whole course about becoming an individual and getting that together, and I think that's just really important to understand. And I think, like musicians, I think it's important to start dedicating time to that practice. And so whether it's last week's exercise where you don't take your camera, you sit somewhere with a journal and just take notes and think through things and ask yourself, what would make this an interesting picture? What is there a story that can be told here? Is there something visually that's interesting? Is there something I'm not seeing or not thinking about that's less obvious? Anybody can stand there and take a photo, but what can you do with a scene, an object, a situation, a person, whatever it is you're shooting, that stands out and becomes different, if you will? And that's the whole point of what this involves. I want to talk about something I've talked about. I may have mentioned it on the video podcast, but I definitely talked about in the podcast I do with Wade, the audio podcast. And it's a concept that there's an author, Seth Godin, and he's written an entire book on this. It's not a long book. I recommend reading it. It's called The Dip. And you can probably read it in 1 or 2 sittings. It's really short and relatively inexpensive to buy. And Seth Godin talks about something called the dip. And the dip basically is anybody who does creative work or considers themselves an artist. And let me stop right now and talk about what Seth Godin's definition of an artist is. And an artist can be anybody who is passionate about what they do. And so that covers everybody from what we think about as a traditional artist, so somebody who paints, somebody who draws, a photographer, but it also extends to somebody who's climbing the ladder of a corporation, wants to be CEO one day. They have something they're passionate about doing, something that they work very hard at, and a goal they're trying to achieve. And we all, no matter what it is that we're doing, whether you're an artist or you're, a CEO or what is it, we have what is called the dip, okay? And I'll paraphrase his book a little bit by saying that the dip, basically when you start out doing something, there's a point where you realize pretty early on that you may have a knack for something or you may have a natural talent for it. So let's put it in our terms here for photography. You probably remember the first time that you either borrowed a camera from somebody or bought your own, and you took a couple pictures and you took a couple more, and then all of a sudden, like, something clicks. Like, one, you realize you really love doing it. There's kind of a passion that's inside of there. And then also, you probably have some feedback from some people. So maybe you put an image on Flickr and you got some nice comments back. Or perhaps you took images at a family function and your relatives all told you they were wonderful and can you bring your camera more often and shoot more things. Sorry, my cat is here. And so, you realize that you have that initial burst of kind of, it's not inspiration, but you have a realization that you have a talent for something, okay? And then what happens is you have this crest that shoots way up, and all of a sudden you realize, okay, wow, this is something I can be good at. And then it shoots way down because within the next couple of weeks you realize that there's some frustrations there. You can't do everything that you thought you could do in your mind, and that's good, that's okay, because your mind is working at that point. And then you kind of start feeling like, well, I'm not any good at this, or I kind of stink at this. And the dip is learning how to get out of that well, it's a dip, out of that lull. And the dip also includes not only personal frustration, but I think career choices too. So let's say, for instance, maybe you have a career aspiration as a photographer. There's other things that are going to contribute to that dip as well. There are things like not being able to find work, having clients that are slow to pay, just having a hard time struggling and trying to get that. Like if somebody in a corporation might be, their goal one day is they're like, I really like leadership. I want to be the CEO of this company. I want to lead everybody. Their dip is climbing a political and corporate ladder trying to get there. And so the dip represents something that we all have to go through with that. And even if you're just trying to get better as a photographer or develop a personal style or whatever that is, learning how to deal with what Seth calls the dip. And anyway, this book is wonderful. There's way more to it. He talks about, how to, when it's a good idea to give up on certain things and try different things. Sometimes, I think as human beings, we tend to put all of our passion and energy into one little aspect, and not just like photography, but like, I want to shoot weddings, and so maybe it turns out that you're not really well suited for weddings, and product photography or something else, events, is a better thing for you. Anyway, learning how to size those things up and stop doing them. But anyway, what I'm talking about in today's podcast in this masterclass episode is learning how to kind of deal with the dip and lean into it. And realizing that, okay, what I'm setting out to do is to try to make something change or do something different. So last week it was sitting with a journal and no camera and trying to see things differently in your mind. And that's hard. That's part of the dip. And learning how to lean into that a little bit and work with it and embrace it and enjoy it even. And then that's when you start cutting through and coming back up. And I think another big thing is a phrase that I call concerning yourself with the now, okay? And last week, actually it was the week before last, through my work with the museum, I got to meet an artist, Mark Bradford. He's an American artist, lives in Los Angeles, and does these brilliant kind of collage pieces. And in a discussion that several of us were having, he mentioned that, you know, when you're an artist and you see a lot of people that are kind of struggling, they're trying to get better, they're trying to have a career, whatever it is they're trying to do, you see a lot of people who start kind of bringing this negative point of view into play. And, you know, I'm not where I want to be. They always want to be somewhere else. Okay. And that can happen on many levels, a career level, or it can even happen on an artistic level where it's like, okay, I'm not shooting the kind of pictures that I want to be taking. And you become frustrated and think, okay, well, and you want to live somewhere in the future that doesn't exist yet. And Mark Bradford had mentioned that, you know, he said, I'm not concerned with that. I'm concerned about the now, because that's where you are, that's what you can control, that's what you can deal with, and that's where the fun happens. And so learning how to, you know, embrace that, embrace the dip, and concern yourself with the now. And I think that helps you get through a lot of this stuff. So anyway, so moving on to today's lesson, which is going to be photographic meditation, is what I'm calling this. Now, right off the top here, I want to make a disclaimer that I'm not a big meditation guy on any kind of religious or spiritual level, but what I'm doing here is we're taking some elements, and there are a lot of different kinds of meditation we'll kind of get into a little bit, but we're taking some inspiration, some elements from meditation and bringing them into the practice of photography. And if some of you do meditate on some kind of serious level, I would be interested if you want to email me later and talk about, you know, maybe you have some thoughts on this too. But the key here is single-pointedness of mind, okay? So like last week, the lesson was removing distractions, and mainly the distraction of the camera and all the controls, the knobs, etc. that you've got on that, and rethinking that in a way that you're refocusing your mind, no pun intended, on something else. And that's important. And so today we're going to bring it down even further, even though we're bringing the camera back into the equation. But the whole point of this is single-pointedness of mind. So allowing your mind to concentrate on one specific thing. And I think that's important. Okay, so some words on meditation. I pulled this from Wikipedia, so not, you know, obviously a brilliant source, but I wanted a general reference for this. And meditation, and this is in a broad sense, and this is all I'm trying to pull into what we're doing today, but meditation refers to any form of a family of practices in which practitioners train their minds or self-induce a mode of consciousness to realize benefit. So let me repeat that so we can kind of take it slow. So meditation refers to any form of a family of practices, so there's a lot of different kinds of meditation, in which practitioners, meaning you who's meditating, are training your mind or self-induce a mode of consciousness to realize benefit. Okay, so what we're doing is we're wrapping our minds around something, and there's some goal to this. It's not just sitting there thinking about nothing or thinking about one thing, and and we'll talk about that in a second, because if you've never meditated, your mind does weird things. So when you meditate on something, and you're forced to look at it from many different angles. Okay, so what we're doing, like you could kind of consider last week's exercise a form of meditation. We took one thing, and you're forcing your mind to exhaust a number of different angles and possibilities. Okay, and including some you've probably never thought of. And you're forced to reach down into the depths of your identity and individuality. And I think that is very key. And so what that means is, for instance, you and I could probably be sitting in the same situation, or let's just say we're shooting a still life of an object. And the object is what it is. That doesn't change. And this is very metaphysical here. Your object is consistent, but the difference in how you or myself would interpret this and want to represent this with the camera are going to be completely different. So what we're both doing is we're reaching into the depths of our individuality. And I think that's really key. Are either one of them going to be good? Well, I hope they're both good, but they're going to be different, and that's the point here. We're not going for quality, we're creating change here is what we're trying to do. So learning how to concentrate. And I think this is something that I've heard a lot of people say recently. And I think sometimes there's a general kind of reaction to, I was talking earlier about, we're in this Google age where, life is an open book test. And I don't know culturally what people define that as. But when I was growing up, in elementary school, we would have, you have two kinds of tests. You have tests you have to study for, and then sometimes they give you an open book test where you're allowed to use the book. And the whole point is, I can open the book and learning how to use the book to find the reference to the material that you're trying to find. And life really is an open book test now. The answer to anything you can be found on Wikipedia, Google, a number of sources. And I think with that same thing comes this rate of information that's very fast. People are not taking the time to really sit there and learn something in depth. And for instance, let me give you an example. Let's say I'm interested in something random like nuclear physics. Well, I can go on Wikipedia right now and probably within an hour follow enough links and read enough about it to become what I've heard referred to as the advanced novice. Okay. I will know some things. I can probably even start a conversation with somebody about nuclear physics, but I don't really understand that yet because I haven't done all the practice that's involved with that. I haven't explored problems. I haven't done, whatever science experiments would come with that. And that's really important to understand because I think a lot of people go into photography the same way. They go online, it's easy to get some answers, a camera manual, and you figure enough out to become an advanced novice. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think we all start there. But it's not obvious where to go from there. And I think that's what I'm trying to address today with a lot of this stuff with meditation. And meditation, what we're actually doing is, a lot of times, I mean, you guys probably feel like this too. We live in an age where most of us work on a computer, whatever your day job is. Even if you're a photographer, it's your day job. A lot of your work is done on the computer. We all have to deal with things like email, which is a huge distraction to life in general. And sometimes it's easy to start feeling overwhelmed with this speed and rate of information that's coming down the pike towards you. And so what we're doing with meditation is trying to eliminate all those distractions and get yourself into a place where you're relaxed and you can think. Now, the first couple times you're going to do something like this, if you've never done meditation before, you might get tired. You might want to actually take a nap because your body and your mind are moving at such this incredible pace that as soon as you stop, I had a friend that went to seminary. He became a priest a few years ago. And I remember he visited a monastery and he mentioned that the first thing you do when you're meditating and you have this quiet around you all of a sudden is, he said, people fall asleep. And everybody realizes that's okay, that you need to kind of get through that. That's part of your dip and you're going to come back up. But after that, you're going to realize, okay, you're alone with your thoughts and learning how to control that and not get bored or let your mind wander because the obvious thing to do is start getting hungry or thinking about what's on television later or, because it's quiet, you've got time and your mind's just going to do stuff like that. And so what we're going to do is kind of learn how to eliminate some of these distractions. So, and this is going to relate to our assignment for this week. But one thing you want to do when we're going into this meditative practice here is the first thing you need to understand is that you need to allow yourself some time. So, if you've got a meeting in an hour, that's not a good time to start meditating, I don't think, because your mind's going to start going towards that. Or if you might be able to do it if you get up early in the morning before work because your mind has been resting while you've been sleeping. But I wouldn't do it if you're going to go out with your friends in 30 minutes and you just want to get a quick meditation in. You might be able to do some of that, but you really don't want to be worried about anything or distracted mentally. So this is a good weekend activity. It's a good evening activity, something of that nature. So anyway, so what you want to do is allow yourself time. You want to turn off the phone. You want to eliminate all your distractions. Don't sit at the computer. Please do not have your email open, even if you're not sitting at the computer. It's dinging every time you get an email that's come in. What you want to do is you want to eliminate all distractions. Turn off your phone. Get rid of everything. Make sure, in my case, I've got 2 cats that are very high maintenance these days, and make sure they're fed. You want to eliminate everything. You want to narrow everything down to just you and the subject that you're meditating on. Okay, so developing habits. I think there's a lot of things we're talking about right now, just forced meditation. One of the things that's nice about being a photographer and this whole act of photography, there are a number of things that actually, how do I put here, there are activities that force this sense of meditation that you're going for anyway. So for instance, for me, I know it's kind of archaic by today's digital standards, but I have a darkroom and I use it and I love to print. And I'll be honest, the majority of the photos that I create are distributed online. That's where most people see them. And I think the minority are actually prints that I make. And maybe that would change one day, but that's just kind of how it is now. And so why would I spend an inordinate amount of time in the darkroom. Well, that's an activity that for me is very meditative in nature. It forces you into that meditation because generally you don't go into the darkroom and start firing off 20 prints that are all different. You go into the darkroom and you are forced to deal with one print, and you're thinking about it, and you're thinking, but I think it extends beyond that, because what I start doing mentally is I start judging the quality of the actual image, not so much the print, even though that's what I'm concentrating on. And that shapes my mentality and my attitude of what I'm going to photograph in the future. And that's really important to understand. For instance, at one point a couple years ago, I was doing a lot of still lifes, and I'm at a point where I'm revisiting a lot of those and making prints. And it's something I love doing. And because they're a couple years old, I'm worried about the print quality, and I'm happy with some of them, but there are little changes and things that I want to start doing differently. And I think it's really important to have that time to do. And if I weren't doing that darkroom work, I might not be looking at older work as critically as I do. So I think that's something that is very beneficial to all of us as photographers. Even if you're not a darkroom guy, I mean, I'm not giving a big sell for film process, but let's say that you are working on images in Aperture or Lightroom or whatever your editor of choice is. You're doing post-production at the computer. That can be a form of meditation too, particularly if you're dealing with one image for a long amount of time. So if you go in, especially older images, if you go find some older stuff that you've been working on, you'll start to see it differently because you're spending time doing some edits. You can't retake the photo at that point. It's already taken. And so that will start your mind kind of thinking about your process and your approach to your own work. And I think that's really essential. So anyway, back to this concept of what we're doing is where we're actually creating time to sit down and do this photographic meditation. And your assignment this week is going to deal with this. Meditation in the beginning, there are a lot of problems that you're going to deal with. And the first, if you've never meditated before, is you're going to, what we're going to do, let me give you the assignment parameters here a little bit first too, so you know what I'm talking about. But what we're going to do is we're going to take, there's several situations that I'm going to put you in, but for instance, one of them is we're going to do a still life. So you're going to pick an object. And it can be whatever. It can be a set of keys, it can be a glass of water, it could be anything. And you're going to set aside, I would try and go for an hour. If you can't concentrate that long, go as long as you can. Try 30 minutes, see if you can do it. Try 15 minutes. But what you're going to do is focus on that one object in particular for that duration of time. And this is hard because what will happen is you're going to sit down and you're going to think of about 2 or 3 cool angles you could shoot this object from. You're going to think of a couple things you could do with lighting, and pretty soon you're going to exhaust all your material. And that's just simply a limitation of your own mind and what you're putting into it. So after that, what's going to happen is your mind will start to wander because you have 40 minutes left and you got it all done in 20. And you start to wonder about what's on television later. There's a baseball game from last night, would be my case. Hey, maybe you're hungry, it's time to go eat. But it's important to realize, and this is the whole practice of this, is when your mind starts to do that, realize it and try to bring it back in. So it's a struggle in a sense between what your mind wants to do and what you want to direct it to do. As you go along and as you do this more, this does get easier. And I think it's a huge, it's a great habit to get into because this starts influencing regular work. Let's say you're shooting a wedding or you have a client or something like that. Your brain is going to be able to think much more quickly and be able to concentrate differently. So that's the whole point of these exercises. So we, like I mentioned last week, we did some meditation on this photographic memory. And so maybe that's something to do. Like you've exhausted all the angles. Well, actually, that's the first thing I would do is bring this back to what we talked about last week with photographic memory exercises. So put the camera down for a minute and think about it. Look at the object and start asking yourself questions. Is there something this could be doing that I'm not doing right now? Could I introduce motion into this somehow? So maybe if you're dealing with water or something like that, you can stir it up, you can agitate, something like that. If you're dealing with a set of keys, well, would it look different if I tried to get a photo of them dropping? I'm just saying, we're coming up with new possibilities here. Don't shoot yet, just think through these things. Would this look different in a different setting as far as what I've got for a background? So if you're shooting a small object, would this look different if I changed the table, if I put it on the floor? What if I went outside, go back inside if you've been outside? What about the lighting conditions? Does this look differently if I light it differently? Would it look different if you're using natural light? Would it look different at night than it does during the day? And so those are the things to start asking yourself. Pick up your camera and start exploring some of these and keep going. if you're really starting to get exhausted or running out of time, start capturing these and writing them down in your journal. That's important. So make sure you have your journal handy. We all run out of time, and it's important to capture ideas. So anyway, what we're going to do is actually, there's 2 stages to this assignment. We're going to pick an object, and we're going to be doing a still life, okay? So it can be anything, like I mentioned. And what you want to do is just really concentrate on, exhaust all the possibilities. In fact, what's interesting is I think a lot of people, when they begin these exercises, okay, so the first part of this is you're going to be shooting a still life. The first reaction is, okay, I need to shoot something that's cool, so you're trying to come up with ideas of what to shoot, and you spend a lot of time on that. And then, and I've done this before too, you decide, okay, I want to do, like flowers, or I want to do fruit or something like that for my still life. And so now I've got to go to the nicest grocery store in town and go spend a lot of money and pick through objects. And that's all fine, but that's kind of beside the point. This is an exercise, not a piece we're creating for a museum. So it's really important to, I think the more ordinary the object is that you have, the better. So it can be a pencil, whatever, just use something around you, don't spend money on it. I'll give you a example here. I did a podcast, it was a video podcast a couple months ago on Carl Blossfeldt, who does these beautiful, he's no longer living, but in his day did these beautiful botanical studies. And I mentioned in the podcast, and I have his book right here, let me show you. Because I think this is going to illustrate a wonderful point here. Okay, Blossfeldt. I got this out last time to show you, and it's still sitting here next to the camera. So anyway, Blossfeldt did these wonderfully beautiful studies. And what's interesting too, get that on frame, is Carl Blossfeldt was not, or did not consider himself to be a photographer. Okay, this is the Taschen book. In case you're interested, you can go watch the podcast and get the info on that. He considered himself a scientist, a teacher, a botanist, and did these just beautiful photos of plant life. And what's interesting is they're very foreign looking. Like I think that's kind of some of the appeal to his work, is that they're things that you don't see every day. And one of the techniques that he used on these were all shot, and I've done a lot of research, and I have not been able to dig up what kind of camera he was using, because these are pretty early. Let's see if it has dates on any of these. But anyway, the technical level of photography was not where it is today. So it wasn't like you could go out and get a nice macro lens to shoot. But a lot of times, this book does have the enlargement. So this is a 10x enlargement. So this image right here is 10 times the size as it would be in real life. So these are enlarged and blown up. And you can tell that his printing techniques too are cropped and enlarged. And anyway, but what's interesting about Blossfeldt is that in interviews, he never spent any money on plants. So he wouldn't go buy things to photograph. And I think this is really interesting. He used things that he found. They were all found plant life near where he lived. And I think that's pretty essential, because here's a guy who did this brilliant, genius stuff with stuff that was everyday to him that he found. But, and here's the thing, he found a different way to photograph it and a different way to bring it into realization that made him unique. And that's, I think, why he's considered one of the great photographers of all time. And it was his personal spin that he took on it. I don't think he intentionally did it, but he sure as hell did. And that's what we're going for here. So you can pick something that's average, that's everyday. Do what Carl did. Make a macro shot. Blow it up as big as you can. Get in tight. If you need to go get filters or a magnifying glass, I've done all kinds of ghetto things with cameras, by the way. The point is not to spend money on things, either subject or equipment, but the point is to try to do something different with what you've got that's unusual and unique. And so that's one thing. The second thing you're going to do is I would pick an object, and this is going to be something that's large scale, possibly outdoors, or if it's indoors, make sure it's a huge space. So I know some of you are in cold climates right now, and so you might want to stay inside, but I would, pick a shopping mall or something, but pick an object that you are going to photograph and allow yourself the time to deal with that. So this could be something in an outdoor setting. So it could be a building. Maybe you're thinking about doing an architectural shot. I want to say right now too, if you're allowing a full hour to spend shooting things, be careful with what you're shooting. And the only reason I say that is because some buildings, I got in trouble once. I was downtown with a friend of mine and we were doing night shots. So we weren't doing any meditation, but they were night photos late at night, and they required really long exposures. And this was back during a period where I was doing this macho kind of thing where we would go out with the slowest speed film we could possibly find. So I was using like ISO 50, like Ilford Pan F. So we'd go out And then get the aperture down to like f16 or something. So there were these beautiful tack sharp night shots with very little grain. And we do stand development when we come back. And I had several friends and we were all kind of doing this. I had one that was even bringing a pinhole camera along at one point, which was just completely insane. But we'd sit there and do 45-minute exposures or an hour and a half long exposures. We'd leave the camera and hang out and come back and it was an incredibly interesting learning process. But back to what I was talking about is we were downtown and there's a Federal Reserve building, which is actually part of the federal government that handles money. and they have very tight security. And I was across the street on a bridge, so I wasn't on the property. But I did have a camera aimed up at the building. And at one point I had my light meter, which has the with the spot meter in it. And so I was aiming to look up. Well, a couple of the guards caught this on camera and came down. What's funny is I still got the shot because the camera was just sitting open, and I don't think they realized that I was making such a long exposure. So we sit there and talk, and they took my driver's license and threatened and all this nonsense. Anyway, my point is don't get into trouble when you're shooting outdoors. So make sure you're in a fairly public place where it's not going to be awkward for you to be there an hour. I don't want to get anybody into trouble based on something I told you in a MasterClass. So anyway, government buildings, things like that. In this day and age, the post 9/11 era, I think I would just be careful with things like that. Maybe that's a good time to go without the camera and your notebook and sit there and do some meditation with it, because that's going to be less weird, I think, to people. But anyway, photographing in open spaces, just be careful with that. That's all I'm saying. But anyway, you want to pick a building or something that's fairly large scale. So we're dealing with the first part of this assignment is smaller objects, smaller scale things. And then the second part is to go deal with something on a larger scale. And like we did last time, I want you to sit there and think through this. And this is a meditation practice. Now, you'll have your camera here, and you'll be shooting these things. Now, one of the questions you might have is how many photos do I need to end up with when I'm through? Well, as many as it takes. If you come away from this and you did more thinking than shooting, I think that's fine. If you come out with 4 shots and spend an hour, there's nothing wrong with that. The whole point is to get your mind working. If you come back with 150 shots, that's great too. If you come back with 2,000 pictures, the higher the number, the less thinking you're probably doing and machine gunning it. And be careful with that, because the whole point of everything we're talking about this specific masterclass is to bring that down to a more thoughtful level, and we're talking about exercising the mind in this case. So anyway, so you can shoot as much as you need to, but just make sure you're thinking through things. In fact, I think the better you get at this stuff. So let's say that 3 years from now, you've kind of done a lot of this stuff off and on a semi-regular basis, hopefully, and you've been working at it. I think that you probably, if you're going to spend a whole hour on something, would probably come away with less shots, because you're not going to, like I said a minute ago, this machine gun style photography where you're just snapping away. You're learning how to think more and then shoot. And there's really nothing wrong with that. Now, photography is kind of weird, because depending on what style of photography you shoot, sometimes you do have to start gunning it. Like, for instance, if you do street photography, things can be gone in an instant. And that's when you do need to take a lot of pictures to make sure you get it. If you're shooting, if you do events, like let's say this is either weddings or just any kind of event-based photography, you want to get a lot of shots, because facial expressions change, and you might have somebody with a nice smile for 1 second who's talking and it's a casual look, and within half a second that goes to something that would be an embarrassing photograph. So that's why you take a lot of shots in a situation like that. But I think in general, though, that more deliberate picture that you're going to take is what we're striving for. So, you've thought it through, you know what you're going after, and being able to realize that. So that is basically what we're looking at as far as assignments this week. We are about 40 minutes in today, and we're a little shorter than last time. So does anybody have any questions on anything? I have not been watching the chat room, because I can't multitask here and teach and watch questions that fly by. So if anybody has any questions, post them in the chat. And I'd be happy to answer some stuff. So I'm also curious if anybody was able to do last week's assignment, and did you find it easy or hard, or were there any challenges involved of that nature? A lot of this stuff isn't easy, especially if you're forcing your mind into thinking about photography and you don't have a camera with you. This week, take a camera with you. This week we're working on getting shots, and I think in general, you should start seeing improvement pretty quick with a lot of this stuff. Stephen Cottrell, what are you doing for this project assignment? What am I doing specifically, or do you mean what are we going to do with them? If you want, I'd be happy to show you next week. I could do the assignment too and show you what I came up with. In fact, I probably should. I think that would probably be beneficial for everybody, so we can plan on that. If you want to, how should we do this? Because I didn't think this through first. We do have a Flickr group, which might be the easiest to deal with for the podcast. If you want to put them in the Flickr group, I want to think of a tag. Actually, let's do this. Let's just make it the show. So what you want to do is put two things. If you want to put your photos in the Flickr group, put them in the Flickr group. And where you can do those little tags in Flickr, make sure you tag it with MasterClass Live, all one word, just MasterClass Live. And that way I can look in the group and I can view everything that's in the group with that tag, and then we can kind of talk about work. So yeah, let's do Flickr group and a keyword. And the keyword will be MasterClass Live, all one word. And if you mess that up, make it two words, I'll probably still be able to find it. But anyway, I'll still be working on this with you, and I'll show you what I did last week. The journals are a little different. I'm not encouraging anybody to share those because I don't want anybody. It frames how you approach or how you think if you're planning for the work to become public. And I think that may be okay for this week, but for the journals, it's more important for you to start becoming comfortable with writing for yourself only, because like for instance, if you know that I'm going to see something, I bet you anything your approach changes completely, because all of a sudden you start to edit yourself. You're like, well, wait a minute, I'm not going to write that. That's not cool, or it just alters your mentality. So that's why I'm asking you to keep your journals private for now. Maybe one day we can get to where we show people stuff. But Bill, I'll talk about these in just a second. Let me address some of the other questions. Spence M says, I was really surprised at how many ideas I could come up with in my bedroom. It was a really great exercise last week. It really is. And it's really important to understand that a lot of times I don't think other visual mediums such as sculpture or drawing or painting have the same problem that photography has, but we have this big tool in the way that usually we spend a lot of money on, that we're very obsessed with. It becomes kind of this gadget kind of culture. And a lot of times, and it's natural, I do it too, you start just snapping away at things and you're starting to lose that process. So yeah, so last week, like if you picked your bedroom, just finding things to shoot and try to make it not look like you're in your bedroom. I mean, the idea is not to capture your bedroom. The idea is to start thinking differently and find something you didn't look at the first time and see it differently, and take those notes. And hey, if you guys got some notes in your journals from last week, feel free to take your camera out and try and make some of those shots a reality and realize them. I think that's a big deal. Yeah, imagining images, I think this is great. What happened to the viewer templates you talked about? You were going to put them on the website. That's a very good question, and I did not. I'll tell you what, I will do that today and put them up. So yeah, I apologize for that. It was a little bit of a wild week this week, and I know that's no excuse, but I will have them up, so you will be able to download them. You don't really need a template. You can cut a square into a sheet of paper or something, but I'll put them up either way, and if that make it easier for you. The best advice, this is non sequitur, the best advice I was ever given was to go on a photo shoot without a camera. Frustrating. You start thinking about what you see in a different way. It is frustrating. And speaking from my own experiences, at first you're thinking, well, this is a waste of time, and you give up. And again, this whole thing behind the art of photography is learning how to think. And I think that goes for any visual medium. That goes for any artistic medium. I mean, think about this, like people who write for a living, authors, journalists, what have you. Do you think that they're more concerned about, oh, I have to have a MacBook Pro to write this book on? Or are they concerned about what kind of keyboard they use? Or they're really concerned about thinking things through. And I think that's the most obvious medium. I think photography is just different. And it's because we have gadgets that we start thinking this way. And I'm not slamming it. There's nothing wrong with it. In fact, as we get into this later, I will talk about how your medium and what camera you're shooting on, what medium you choose for photography does affect your style as well. I think less so than using your mind. That's why we're starting here. But that does, if you shoot digital versus shooting 19th century wet plate, that's a huge difference in look, and that can kind of become part of your style. So Thomas Nilsson is in here again. Happened to me involuntarily. I forgot to put batteries in the camera in photo walk. I have done that too. The other thing I'm really good at is leaving a CF card at home, usually in the card reader. I put them there, get my images off, and I get all excited, and then I go grab the camera, and then I forgot to put it back in. So that's something that happens. But actually, as Thomas mentioned, that's important to not waste that time. To really start thinking about it. And not snap away. I mean, here's the deal, guys. Anybody can snap photos. You're here today watching this, and I am very grateful for that. But the reason that you're here isn't so much because you find me interesting. Well, I hope it is, but the real reason you're here is that you want to get better as a photographer and you want to start thinking about things differently. We all want to, I mean, like I said last time, when we're talking about a personal style, remember, you're already an individual. Half the battle right there. What you're trying to do is fuse what makes you an individual into your work, and have that become part of your personality, and that's the most important part. Somebody had asked me about the images behind me, and I can talk about these a little bit. The water tower is not on camera. It's over. Actually, what did I do with the water tower? I think I took the water. The water tower is in a show right now. So it's actually not here. These were all actually Olga images that were taken a while back, and they have been in various shows, and I need to put some new stuff up and just haven't gotten to it because I've been working very hard at preparing masterclasses. So that and a lot of podcasts. So do you have any other podcasters you would recommend to call my ears? Yeah, I could do that. Other podcasters, really in this last year, I've listened to a lot of less podcasts than I used to because I spend a lot of time making these podcasts, and so my time for listening to other people has kind of dwindled a little bit. One guy I will recommend, and he's in the chat watching today, is Stephen Cottrell. Stephen is a very good photographer. He lives in London. And I'll tell you what, I will find his podcast. I don't know it offhand right now, the URL, so I'll put that in the notes when we put the archive up. But I'd recommend Stephen. Stephen does the thing where he interviews other photographers, and there's some very thoughtful stuff that goes into it. It's an audio podcast. It's really quite good. Most photography podcasts, I hate to say this, there are a couple good ones that I've seen that are okay, but most of them just devolve into reviewing equipment. And I mean, you guys can find that on your own. You don't need me for that. There are a couple podcasts. There's one that I like that I still listen to right now. I talked about Merlin Mann earlier. He has a podcast called Back to Work. I think Merlin is extremely interesting. He's a little bit of a nut. He's extremely ADD. He's all over the place. He's very funny. And ironically, he is kind of this productivity guy who talks about stuff. He has a podcast that he's doing on the 5x5 network. So if you go to 5, like the number 5, BY, 5 by, and then the number 5 again, .tv, 5x5.tv. Dan Benjamin, who lives down the road in Austin, that's his podcast network. And they have a podcast they do together called Back to Work. So if you go into iTunes and search Back to Work, you'll find it. It's an audio podcast. And Merlin and Dan kind of have these discussions where they kind of are dealing with an approach to how we deal with work in the modern age. And so it's not about photography. I think it's more about personal success, how to deal with things at work, how to stay organized. I think it's a really interesting way of looking at how habits work of people in office environments versus what you would ultimately be doing if you wanted to be a freelance photographer, how you could make things different. Anyway, it's very funny. It's very good. It can get distracted sometimes because they devolve into personal humor. But Lynn's work, glad you mentioned that, Thomas. Lynn's work I'm a big fan of. I haven't subscribed to it in a while, and it's actually been on my to-do list to go hit the subscribe button and get to again. I really recommend Lynn's work. Brooks Jensen is a photographer slash... I'd never met him, but I imagine he wouldn't want me to define him. He runs a magazine called Lynn's Work. And let me first of all talk about Lynn's work. If you haven't seen Lynn's work, go check it out. Google it, look it up on the web. If you have a nice bookstore that has a magazine section, you'll probably find it there. Lynn's Work is a little tiny magazine that's published, I don't think he's every month, it may be every 2 or 3 months. And it is so beautifully done. And it's him. He does it out of his garage. It's not a company that produces this. And he has found what I think is just brilliant about it is it deals with fine art photography, and he does interviews with photographers in there, and they're all genuinely pretty dang good. In fact, there's people you've never heard of that you just like freak out. They're so good. And he'll have an interview with them. They talk about their approach and what they think about and what they're going for. But anyway, Lynn's work, he has an accompanying podcast on iTunes. And the podcast is interesting too because he just turns on the mic. It's audio. And each podcast is maybe 10 minutes long. They're pretty short, a lot shorter than me. I talk too much. And he just addresses a couple thoughts on photography. And they're very well thought out. They're very interesting. I don't think it has a huge popularity on iTunes, and I think that's too bad. I think he struggles with what I struggle with, where most people want to go on there and get camera reviews. And I like I said, I've never met Brooks, but you can get that anywhere, and I'm trying to offer something different, and I think he is too. And he's really good. And that magazine is so cool. And because it's printed on such a budget, there's a lot of limitations that it has on it, like, you know, just the number of colors they use to print it on. It's mostly black and white work. It's genius. Check out the magazine and the podcast. I'm glad you mentioned that Non Sequitur, because it's amazing. There's some real gems in there. I think Thomas mentioned Lynn's work. Yeah. So check him out. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. I mean, I think just podcasts in general, and I have to be careful saying this because I'm not trying to insult anybody, but I would like to see more stuff like what Lynn's work does. There's I'm trying to think of what the other, I'm forgetting names of them because I just don't watch them religiously, but there are some other good ones. But I would like to see more of that. I think the problem with a lot of podcasts is that at one point when Apple and iTunes had come out and they didn't quite have the music store in yet, and they kind of took this thing of podcasting and made that really accessible and really easy. And this is not a slam against Apple, I'm just talking about the change that's occurred. But I think over the years, they do have a music store now, and they have other things. So there are other content options on iTunes. Now, they still are very nice to podcasters, and they still have a podcasting section on there. It's just different now because it's kind of fallen to the bottom, and I think it's just a different thing than it used to be. A lot of times, unfortunately, a lot of podcasts I see are businesses that are running them as commercials. Again, it's just photography reviews. I think these people are more interested in getting huge volumes of viewers. And it's perfectly understandable. You need sponsorship. I don't have sponsorship, and it's hard to do because I do it as a secondary job. But if you're going for that, you almost have to serve something to the masses. So yeah. Lynn's work can be downloaded as a PDF, but check it out. I really recommend you look at the magazine. There's a big difference between looking at a PDF on a screen versus having an actual magazine. In fact, interestingly enough, one of the things that is hot with iTunes and Apple right now is the whole thing of doing magazine subscriptions and PDF readers and stuff like that. The problem that I have and that I struggle with is that a magazine has a different function than an iPad app or a website or something like that. And this is a similar problem that we saw with a lot of people who, all of a sudden were trying to put everything online back, when the internet kind of first became a popular thing. And it's like you're trying to cram, like I remember early on in the internet days when I was doing a lot of web design, I would design websites for clients. We had a term for it, we called it brochureware. And a client would basically want to take their printed brochures and throw all that online, and that was their website. And it's like, man, this is two different mediums. This is two different ways that users are going to approach things. And of course, now you don't see many people doing that nearly as much. They understand that online is different and that you want to cater your content in a much different fashion than the old days. But anyway, I think you're seeing that with books and magazines. All this to say is that Lynn's work is so brilliant. I think the same, in fact, I've gotten like 3 emails about this week. There's that magazine that comes out of England called Black and White that I've talked about on the video podcast on the Art of Photography. I still think is just geniusly brilliant. And it does a nice job. They have advertisement, they do camera reviews, they do all that stuff. And I think what I'm the most impressed with that magazine is they do such a nice job of balancing out stuff that's commercial in nature with stuff that's actually of substance that you could learn from or find interesting. So Black and White is huge in that regard. And Stephen Cottrell saying free equipment from sponsors and whatever. I'm just not interested in it. How did I get started in podcasting? So many out there, or how do you get started in general? How do you get started in podcasting? So many out there, so lots to sort through. We'll check out Lynn's work. I assume you're talking about how do you get into podcasts. Just open iTunes and there's a little tab on there that says podcasting, and you click on that and it'll take you through there, and you can search. There's categories, there's all kinds of things. Non sequitur, I would love to come to Ireland. That is one of the places I would love to travel to. Oh, let's talk about England. I will be in England. The dates. It's the last week of November, so it will be Thanksgiving in the U.S. and I'm actually leaving. And I don't think I'll make it to Ireland this time, but we'll definitely be in London. And Stephen was at the meetup we did last time. Stephen's a good guy, and I hope he can show up again because it was a lot of fun. So we'll do another one. Photo Focus, I haven't listened to much. Chase Jarvis's video podcast. Chases are different. Chase Jarvis, one thing that I want to say, complimentary to Chase, is that he is a master at, well, two things. One, self-promotion, and this is a compliment. I'm not trying to be snarky or sarcastic. He is so good at it. Go look at his website. That's how every photographer, myself included, should be presenting their work. Chase has this really awesome behind-the-scenes view that he wants to show everybody. He runs a pretty interesting blog. And regardless of whether you like his work or not, I think he does so many things right. It's hard for me to recommend him as a podcast because his stuff doesn't come out that same way. It's more like if you're a fan of Chase, you can follow his work, and there are worse things you could do. But he doesn't have a kind of an episodic, if you will. He doesn't do episodes in a format where he talks about things and leads them into the next. But I mean, that's not a slam against Chase. He does so many things that are really interesting. And of course, he's the epitome of the cool photographer. He does the cool clients. He does skateboarding. He does snowboarding, and he's a pretty cool dude himself. I've never met him, but he does some really neat stuff. Another cool thing that they're doing is they have a MasterClass sort of type thing. It's the Creative Live or something like that that they're doing, which is pretty cool. Anyway, yeah, I mean, teach their own, but there's here's the deal is like, I think it's really easy, and I get this way, and I have to pull myself back, where you start getting really critical of what's out there, and I'll be honest, there are a lot of people out there, with podcasts and everything, promising this career in photography or teaching how to go pro that really have no business doing it. And I've mentioned that on the podcast I've done with Wade before. And I try not to devolve into that a lot because, I just think, well, one, it's not responsible to do as a podcaster, and two, it's I would rather spend my time thinking of positive stuff to cover. But I think there's something you can learn from anything. So check it all out. I mean, if you find a podcast that you find remotely interesting, you don't have to subscribe and be religious about it, mine included. You can watch a couple episodes and take it from there and come back. I mean, that's the great thing about all this stuff. And I told you, especially with Chase Jars, Vincent LaFerre is another guy who's pretty interesting. Vincent's a great photographer. He was a staff photographer, I believe, with the New York Times for years and years, and he's out on his own now. And he does brilliant work. He's kind of ventured into doing the DSLR video thing really heavily, and now he's kind of gone beyond that into actually producing video things. But I think for a lot of photographers, that's going to be how it is. I mean, I think video is going to become a part of that just because we're being equipped for it. But anyway, guys, that's about all I got for today. I hope I addressed some questions, stuff like that. So anyway, join us here next week. In fact, I forgot to do it today. I need to make an agenda on my notes. One thing, most people, or a lot of people, end up watching this in the archives, after the fact later, and I need to mention when the next podcast is. I will actually not be doing it next Sunday, and the reason is because I've been invited. This is really cool. I got invited. If you saw a podcast I did a while back where I talked about darkroom, the Center for Creative Photography, who I'd done that video for, they used it in exhibition, have invited me to a photography conference. It was a discussion. And so it's just basically, I'm going to fly to Arizona, and we're going to do a day-long workshop talking about all kinds of things, from archival techniques to publication in the future to presenting your work. It's really going to be amazing. I was really flattered to have been invited to this. I don't know who's going to be there, but I'm hoping that there'll be some cool folks to meet and some stuff like that. So I'll keep you guys posted on it. I'm sure I'll be able to talk about it afterwards. I think it'll be fun. But anyway, that's where I'm going next week. So if the internet has if the hotel has unbelievable internet, I might try and do a podcast. But I think it's probably easier just to say that maybe I'll do one later this week so we can keep on schedule, maybe on Thursday or something like that. And maybe I could switch the time zone for the folks in Australia and where they're staying up all night to watch me. And by the way, thank you. I'm really flattered that you would do that. So anyway, or we'll just postpone it. We'll do it another time. So if you, I'll get to you in just a second, Gavmatic. If you follow me on Twitter, I'll make the announcements, or just look at the show page. I'll make sure I keep news and stuff updated there. Gavmatic 57 has asked me one question: when's the next Photography Show podcast? Wade and I have both been extremely busy. We have not stopped the audio show. I promise we will get back to it. I don't know when. There's a chance that we might be able to pick it up. It won't be next week. It won't be today, but the following Sunday. We usually do that on a Sunday because we're both around, but lately we haven't been around. So Anyway, that's the deal. Maybe Oxford would be a good plan, M. Huner. So anyway, I will be in England. I will make another announcement with that. We will do a meetup and photo walk if you're interested, something like that. And that's going to be, I think we're going to go for that last Saturday in November. And I don't have a calendar in front of me right now, but I will make sure that I announce that next time. So anyway, guys, thank you so much. I'm so flattered that people, it says 181 total views here, which blows my mind that 181 people would be interested in watching something live about photography. So yeah, particularly something that I'm doing. So anyway, it's really cool. That will be in London, Spence. Last time we did our meetup in London, we met up at South Bank, which usually, the Tate is right there, and the Tate does have some cool stuff going on right now. And I think last time we went and saw we went and saw an exhibition. So Bath, I went to last time, but we didn't do a meetup there. I love the city of Bath. Bath is one of my favorites. Bath is cool, and let me tell you why I like Bath. Bath has this weird touristy thing going a little bit because the Roman baths are there, and there's, but it is so beautiful out there in the country. And there's something about that part of England that just, when we were there last time, we took the train out there, and there were train strikes going on anyway, that we couldn't get there till the evening. So basically, we took a train all the way to Bath. This was last September. We took a train all the way to Bath just to go for a long walk through a bunch of parks and eat at a nice Italian restaurant and then take another train home. So it was worth it. Do it again in a second. So anyway, you guys, thank you so much. I will catch you next time. We got some new podcast episodes about to air. I am still compressing and getting things worked out on that, so they'll be coming out soon. So anyway, once again, thank you guys for joining me, and I will see you, won't be next week, but I will announce. It will either be the week after next, or I might try and do a weeknight this week. So stay on Facebook, or not Facebook, on Flickr or Twitter, and I'll announce it there. So thanks, everybody, and I will see you next time.